Well, I enjoyed lunch. I don't know about you. It was really good lunch. So thank you for coming back after lunch. In putting this workshop together, we've now heard about communities of practice and how you, some ideas about how you may apply that concept. And to tie it all together, we've asked Dr. Olav Sorenson to give a presentation on now moving into the area of commercialization. It's interesting to note that Olav seems to have crossed the country and overseas in being a professor. He's been at the London School of Business. He's had appointments at the University of Chicago, UCLA, and he currently is the Jeffrey S. Skoll Chair in Technical Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. Reading his biography or short biosketch here, it's interesting to note that he's very interested in the context of founding firms, the social relations influencing economic exchange. So I think this is a very appropriate aspect of what we need to learn here for this workshop. So please welcome Olav Sorenson.
I'm not sure if I have the more challenging position or if Deborah did. She was sitting between you and lunch. I now have to deal with the sort of impending food coma. But I'm going to try and at least keep you from completely falling asleep. But if you see your neighbor nodding, kind of poke him a little. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different from what the morning sessions were about. I'm not talking in particular about this sort of concept of communities of practice. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review some of the literature on really commercialization, academic literature on commercialization, and what seems to have worked across different areas and what does not seem to work. This is an incredibly vibrant area. So in a sense, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a survey. There's hundreds of studies that have been done, and I'm just going to try and sum up what I think are a few of the sort of key points that emerge from that literature. In most cases, I'm going to provide a little bit of data from one particular study, but in most cases, there are a dozen or more that have kind of similar types of issues and results. So in terms of kind of how I think about this, so my background is a sociologist, and so I tend to think about interactions between people. I, however, spend most of my time interacting with economists, which means I have to spend a lot of time convincing that they're important. But the way to kind of, sort of conceptually think about, sort of how I'm going to structure this talk is that, think about, sort of there's an idea. Right? So in the sort of commercialization process, I'm not going to talk a lot about where those ideas come from. I'm just going to assume that there's some generation of ideas, and now the problem is how do we get those ideas actually into practice, right? How do we get those ideas to be used, to be commercialized, to have money made out of them? That requires other actors, right? So one of the other critical actors is management, right? It's not enough to just have an idea that's sitting out there. It's not quite true that if you just build a better mousetrap that people will come and find that mousetrap and sort of miraculously decide to start using it. You typically need to build an organization. You need to worry about manufacturing. You need to be worrying about marketing, etc. There's also resources. In particular, one that tends to be very important to commercialization is money. Right? All of these things, funding the development of the idea, funding the management team, buying manufacturing capacity, or sort of working on the development of how you're actually going to get from kind of an early alpha model to a beta to actually getting something that's going to be coming out of a factory. All of this requires money, right? So the key problem here, I think, is really how do you put these pieces together, right? So, all of these pieces exist out there, but the question is why aren't they finding each other? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of structure what we know from research around just a few topics. So the agenda is I'm going to talk about the fact that inputs matter, and I'll be more specific on that in a minute. The second one is that incentives matter. People actually need to have a motivation for doing what they're going to do. Third one is that co-location matters. And, this has already been brought up as kind of one of the themes for the day, but even with modern communication mechanisms, what we tend to see is if we look at these actual linkages between people, they tend to be between people that are located in the same area. We don't see a lot of, broad connections, and I'll speak a little bit to why I think that's the case. And the last one is this, sort of idea that connections matter. And I'm going to say that it's not just connections, but when I get there, I'm going to say that it's a particular type of connection that matters, and that those are the ones that, in a sense, the market fails to provide. And so if you're thinking about, what types of interventions could a policymaker have, it's really to maybe come in and try and provide those types of connections. So turning to the first, as we can see, my animation is not ideal here, but if I get there we go. Inputs matter is the first sort of item on the agenda, and I just want to turn quickly over to where do new ideas come from. So there's a fair amount of research into exactly, sort of who are the founders, particularly of academic entrepreneurs. There's also a whole literature on entrepreneurship in general, but in terms of what I think most of this audience is interested in, you're not so interested in people that are starting dry cleaners or franchise restaurants. You're much more interested in people that are going to maybe start, something like a laser company or a biotech, something that may well have its roots originally in academic research. So a nice recent study on this is by Toby Stewart and Waverly Ding. And they actually track all life sciences in the United States basically from World War II on, right? And they say, which of these people became entrepreneurs and how were they different from those that did not become entrepreneurs? And there are a few sort of key things that came out. The first one is that by far the most important determinant of whether or not somebody's going to have an idea that's worth commercializing is whether or not they publish a lot, right? In fact, it's hard to underemphasize this. For every publication that a person has, their likelihood of being able to start a venture rises by 1%. Right? It's not uncommon in life sciences for a person to have 30, 40, 50 publications or more, hundreds. Right? So you can see that this is really potentially a significant effect. The second one is those that have patented. Well, in one sense, this is not that surprising, right? Because if they've patented, they're showing an interest in something commercial. They're actually trying to get property rights over their intellectual property. But it also indicates that they maybe even have something that has commercial value versus something that is really sort of purely fundamental science that doesn't have any obvious applications. What I think is interesting about this is that it's number 2 on the list, right? Whether or not you have patented is actually less important than the amount that you've published in predicting whether or not, at least in life sciences, you're likely to be someone that can commercialize an invention. The third one is those working at...
You mean commercialize it yourself, or have your ideas being commercialized?
Your ideas being commercialized. So this does not necessarily mean that you did it yourself. Though usually there's at least some interaction between you and the firm that commercializes it, which I'll come back to in a minute. The third aspect is those working for top research institutions. So, this was basically defined as kind of top 20 institutions in biochemistry with PhD programs. So those are actually separate things, but having a PhD program is also important. So, why top research institutions? I'll come back to that in 1 second. I think an important thing for the PhD programs is what you oftentimes see in these commercialization. The pattern is that the idea is generated by a senior scientist who's active at the university. The part of the way that they actually transfer knowledge to the venture that starts is through some PhD student that's been trained in their lab, becomes an employee in the startup, right? Which is important, right? There's a lot of tacit knowledge involved, and it's not the case that you can sort of just take the person's published papers, give them to a company, and the company's going to make that into a product, right? So the PhD programs can be kind of an important aspect in this. And the last one, which is also kind of an interesting one, is it turns out that it's incredibly important whether or not coworkers have been involved in commercial ventures. And there's at least a couple of explanations why this might be the case. One is that it has to do with how are you going to find out how you go about the process, right? Well, if somebody else in your department has already done it, it's much easier for you to find out, well, how do I, sort of deal with the technology transfer office, or how do I go and maybe find venture capitalists, et cetera. The other aspect which seems to be somewhat important is the sort of potential stigma. Now, this is really dramatically changing, I think, in the last decade. But until quite recently, there was really a stigma in most academic departments about becoming an entrepreneur or doing anything that was perceived as commercial. And so, sort of having colleagues, particularly senior colleagues, around that had been involved has tended to be, as a big predictor in whether or not more junior colleagues are likely to try and commercialize their ventures. All in all, kind of one way you could think about summing up a lot of this is it does have to do with, kind of star scientists, right? The typical invention is not coming just from your kind of run-of-the-mill person. It's really coming from the people that are also the ones that are driving the academic research in the institution. Now, in that light, I think it's interesting to note that the research does not show that there's really a decline in people's academic productivity when they get involved in commercial research. Right? So I think this is a fear a lot of academic institutions have, that this is going to lead to a decline in their academic standing, but there's really no evidence that that's the case. There is some evidence that there's a change in the direction that people sort of move their research. They do tend to move their research towards problems that are more likely to have a commercial application, but there's no evidence that they're going to sort of stop publishing or publish less in science and nature. They continue to be motivated, presumably by intrinsic rewards, to those ends. What does not matter, actually, is also sort of interesting out of this research. And this is probably, heretical in this crowd, but one of the things that comes with this not mattering is a technology transfer office. Now, in some sense, that may be unfair, right? Because they're just looking at, does one exist, right? And there are other studies that have been done on TTOs that suggest that there are differences across TTOs, but it's really much more nuanced than is there a TTO there or not. And it has a lot to do with the practices of the TTO. So that's the kind of first thing. Where do ideas come from? Now, perhaps not surprisingly then, if we look at, kind of what are the regions that have really become biotech centers, what this graph shows is there's two sets of points on here. We have the stars, right? This is the location of where are the publishing stars, not necessarily people that patent, just the publishing stars in biochemistry and molecular biology, right? And then the dots are where are biotech firms in the United States. What we tend to see is that, it's precisely those regions that are sort of rich in stars that are also seeing a large number of startups in biotech. Now, there's also some interesting information on, kind of the distribution we could think of as stars in the life sciences by country. This is kind of bringing it back maybe to the Canadian context, which I have to admit that I am quite new to. But in the original research that was done on stars, the one that I showed the map from, they also looked at what was the distribution of these stars across countries. And one of the things that you see is that the United States has, sort of far more stars than you would expect, just based on the size of the country, which is probably not that surprising given that the academic institutions, particularly at the sort of university level, are seen as relatively strong internationally. And then we have sort of the other. Japan is the second largest country. The UK and Australia and Canada included as other English-speaking, sort of significant academic areas. Canada, at least in '96, seemed to be lagging in the number of life sciences stars. If I had to look at this, what I would find most disturbing, though, is not the fact that it's lagging, but the fact that at the time, net migration was out of the country, right? So this is where are the star scientists going, and basically the star scientists at the time were leaving the UK and Canada and going to the United States. I've tried to update this to 2007. This is a little bit imperfect because it's based on my own analysis in, admittedly, a relatively short period of time on citation database. But it seems like what's happened now is we had an immense concentration of stars in the United States. So the United States is even further ahead now than it had been at the time. Now the good news is that the UK and Canada, at least, seem to have stabilized at what among most of the, sort of, if we look at other populations around the world, seems to be a fairly average level. But it does suggest that there are, this would be kind of one type of area you could think about having, kind of policy interventions in, really trying to attract more star scientists to Canada. The second sort of aspect I want to talk about, which is, again, my animation is hating me here, is that incentives matter. And in particular, there's kind of two types of evidence that people have looked at for looking at incentives. One is the effect of something called the Bayh-Dole Act. Now, there's been a sort of actually almost an absurd amount of research around this in the U.S. The Bayh-Dole Act was, largely because it was a major policy change and quite controversial in a number of respects. So prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, basically, if you were doing research and your funding came from a federal source, you could not apply for any type of intellectual property rights on the basis of that, right? So that would include, NSF, which would be like the U.S. equivalent of the INSERC, and also SHRC would be sort of also kind of within NSF equivalent in the U.S. But perhaps even more importantly, this applied to everything funded by the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Mental Health, which are actually even larger funders of a lot of the research that has been commercialized. Now, the major change was that the Bayh-Dole Act basically said that you now could maintain property rights on that, right? So now you could sort of do some research in your lab, find something that you think was potentially beneficial. Even if it was funded by federal funds, you could go out and seek a patent on that and then commercialize it for your own gain. Clearly controversial because a lot of the money is coming from the public, right? But then the gains are private. But it has had, in all accounts, a fairly large effect on the degree to which academic research has been commercialized in the U.S. So this is just data from Stanford's Technology Transfer Office, which is just one university. One of the reasons I looked at Stanford is because a number of universities didn't have technology transfer offices prior to the Bayh-Dole Act. This was also an impetus for universities to start thinking more about whether or not they should even commercialize their technology. But one of the things that you see here is that there does seem to be an increase in the number of disclosures, which is basically how many scientists say, I think I found something that might have potential. In both biomedical and software, as well as sort of a number of other subfields. A lot of the disclosures at Stanford are actually also from engineering, which is an extremely large school at Stanford. But we could even think about sort of beyond kind of this kind of gross level of policy. There's also been some research done looking at, well, how much of the rewards really do accrue to individual inventors. And the evidence is that it really matters a tremendous amount, right? So if you look at the number of licenses that you kind of expect that a university would have as a function of, the horizontal axis here is what proportion of the license royalties that accrue to the university go directly to the inventor, right? And then on the vertical axis is how many licenses do you typically see that university has. And there's a pretty clear and extremely strong relationship between the amount that the inventor gets and how many licenses are going to come out of the university. Now, why does that matter? Again, I think this comes back to this idea of what does it actually take to transfer the technology to a company, right? It's not just a matter of giving the company all of the papers or maybe the patent application. Almost invariably, the scientist actually has to be involved to help to transfer the tacit knowledge around the invention to get it to the point where the firm can take over. Now, absent some sort of individual incentives, the inventor doesn't really have much reason to do this, right? If you're thinking about the typical academic who's a star scientist is paid, he's not getting rich, but he's paid reasonably well. He can support his family. He can send his kids to college. He doesn't really have to worry. In his mind, most sort of work involved with commercialization is just taking him away from research, unless there's some real potential for reward out of it. And that's really what having this kind of large share of the royalties can do. Now, universities vary a tremendous amount, both on the total share that goes to the inventor, as well as how they, sort of apportion other parts of those royalties. So at the extreme top end is CMU, which gives about 88% of the licensing royalties on any invention back to the researcher that came up with it, which is really an amazing amount, actually. Now, to the bottom, actually, that I found here was Arizona State University at about 22.5%. I didn't try and look up all of the levels for the Ontario schools. I looked up the University of Toronto. University of Toronto is at 25%, which I would say is pretty close to the low end of that distribution. I would also note, as kind of an interest in passing here, that it took me nearly an hour to find what the royalty rates were for the University of Toronto, and then quite some time to actually decipher what they might mean. And from teaching business classes, I'm actually relatively used to reading legal contracts, and I still found this one to be on the, sort of somewhat obtuse side. So, that may be an issue in itself. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here is I've got sort of a dark orange, which is what goes directly back to the inventor, and a lighter orange, which goes back to the department. So some schools have chosen to, sort of bring rewards back to the inventor in a couple of ways. So, for example, Harvard will give 35% of their licensing revenues directly back to the inventor. Then they'll give about another 35% that's going back to the inventor's department, generally as research funds, PhD student support. So oftentimes that's money that is going back to the inventor, but in an in-kind fashion rather than into the inventor's pocketbook. And it's not clear whether or not that those funds are much less effective than funds going directly back to the inventor, because they do have advantages. The scientist now doesn't have to think about maybe going and spending as much time writing grants and so forth, because they have money just flowing back to support their research through the licensing. Sorry. And the evidence also seems to suggest that those schools that are willing to put a large share, particularly that are willing to give a large share to the individual scientists, outperform what you'd expect, right? So what I've got in these two columns, on the left-hand column, what I have is what is the ranking of the school in terms of just the quality of their biomedical research, right? This has nothing to do with commercial output. This is based entirely on number of publications, where they're published, and the number of citations that the researchers at those schools get. On the right side, I've got what's their commercial ranking. And this is based really just on a combination of how many of their technologies are licensed out and how many firms are founded by scientists that have been involved with the school. And what seems to be relatively clear is that the schools that are high, those are the orange ones, on the proportion that they give back to the individual inventor, do better on the commercialization index than they do on the research index, which is in essence the raw material that they're going in with, right? So they're taking lower quality science but getting more out of it. Okay. Next one, putting the pieces together. All right, so the question here is, I'm sort of shifting over a little bit. So much of the research that I've reviewed in the last 2 points is really research that's out of sort of the economics literature and focused again on kind of inputs and incentives. Now I'm going to sort of shift over to a research stream that's much more driven by sociology, and one that's looking much more at, I think, connections between both organizations and people. So, what's the evidence on where do high technology firms come from? Well, there's basically, again, a handful of things that matter. The first one, and this may not seem that surprising, but if we look at which regions tend to have the most firms of a particular type sort of founded, or where do we see startups, the first and most important thing is that they need to have lots of existing firms in the same industry. Right? Now, on the one hand, that's maybe not surprising. There's a lot of factors that it could account for that. But those existing firms, I think it's important to keep track of them for two reasons. The first is that a lot of high-tech innovation or high-tech startups don't come from universities. In fact, if you look at the numbers, more high-tech startups, even in biotech, come from other biotech firms rather than directly out of academia. That's not to say that there's not sort of some academic link back at the start of it, but once the process gets going, what happens is that research that's conducted at one of these biotechs oftentimes spawns auxiliary ideas that biotech doesn't decide to pursue, but maybe some scientist in there goes off and starts their own firm to pursue. Also, regions that have a lot of firms in the same industry tend to be very deep in managerial talent. Right? So there's a pool of resources available for helping to bring new ideas that might come about in an academic institution or a research center back into industry. Right? You've got experienced management that's dealt with the managing the commercialization process, dealt with getting venture capital money, dealt with maybe taking a firm public, et cetera. The second one is regions that have a strong venture capital community. It turns out that the second most important thing is there money around? And it's not just any money, it's venture capital money. Most of these inventions, because of information problems, right? A bank is not going to lend to a biotech generally because there's just too much that it doesn't know about the science. There's too much that it doesn't know about the people. So what tends to matter is venture capital or investors that are willing to spend more time actually screening the investments and trying to pick into some of the soft items like the firm's strategy, the quality of the science, the quality of the people, as well as willing to put in extra effort into monitoring those investments to make sure that they continue to operate, function well after the money has been put in. Yeah.
Just a question on angels. Are you lumping them into VC?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, and so in this one, I'm lumping angels into VCs, but it's true that actually angels account for a larger proportion of these private investments than VCs. In Canada as well, even in Europe. In fact, I'm not sure of. I'm not aware of any country where VCs actually do account for more dollar value investments than angels. So the third would be regions with inventors. Again, this is sort of repeating the stars, but this is a different type of study. And the last one is regions with universities. And again, this is presumably the star scientists, but I think this is also the labor force, right? A large share of running a biotech is not just having the star scientists, but it's also having potentially dozens of bench scientists who are maybe just have a bachelor's or master's degree, but you need that skilled labor force in order to sort of get fundamental research done. So if we look at kind of what the geography of industries looks like, here what I'm comparing is not the talent, the sort of the stars, but here I'm comparing, well, where do we see venture capital? And where do we see, in this case, the emergence of kind of biotech sectors? And again, we see sort of a strong correspondence, right? It's precisely in those regions that are deep in venture capital, in terms of they've got another number of firms headquartered there, that you see a lot of biotech firms coming out. And I think that one of the sort of key reasons behind that is that venture capital and angel investors might even be more extreme here, tend to invest locally, right? So what I've got here as a graph is on the vertical axis, I'm saying what is the probability that a given venture capital firm was an investor in a venture-funded investment, right? So that I'm only comparing those that actually received venture capital. And then on the horizontal axis is how far away was the headquarters, or actually the closest office of that venture capital firm to the headquarters of the startup company, generally the only location of the startup company. What you see is this sort of dramatic drop-off. In fact, going even 25 miles away drops the likelihood of receiving funding from a venture capital firm by almost half, right? Going to 60 miles away drops it by almost another half. And by the time you get to 120 miles away, the likelihood of being funded it's not zero, but it's very low. And in fact, you almost none of those funding events that you see where the VC is funding more than 120 miles away are where the VC is funding by themselves, right? They're generally investing with another partner, another VC firm, possibly, that is located close to the investment, right? So they're willing to syndicate, they're willing to jointly invest, but they're not willing to go it alone if they're not close to the company. And, that makes sense for a couple of reasons. One is there's sort of you could think about there's a screening side to it, right? So one of the problems for the venture capitalists is precisely how do I take all these business plans or all these ideas that are coming across my desk and decide which of them are really good. And, for some obvious reasons, you might not directly trust the inventor or the entrepreneur who's coming to you and saying, this is the best invention ever. It's going to make $1 billion, right? You might not trust the guy who says, yeah, sure, I've never managed a company before, but, I'm going to be good at this, right? So, one of the things that you see venture capitalists do, which is very sensible, is they rely on their social networks, right? The way that they find these investments, or more accurately, the way that they do due diligence on these networks, these entrepreneurs, is not, to directly ask the entrepreneur, but they look for people that they know, that they sort of trust the opinions of, and then that also know the entrepreneur, right? So they get this one or maybe two-stage removed set of information, but it's information that they feel is much, sort of higher reliability, much more trustworthy. And, since most social networks are highly constrained in space, our ability to sort of make that type of investigation as you go further and further away declines, right? So if you sort of think about where you live, you could imagine doing the same type of due diligence yourself in your own city. You might be able to imagine doing it sort of in a neighboring city in the province, right? You'd probably be hard-pressed to think about how you're going to go about doing this in Calgary or Vancouver unless for some reason you have links to those cities, right? And that's precisely what's driving the kind of selection stage. There's also the sort of monitoring and advising stage, right? Once they've invested in the company, then the idea with venture capital is that it's smart money, right? It's not just a passive investment. They're actually in it. They're going to give you advice on what you need to do in order to kind of better ready your invention either for an IPO or potentially to be acquired by another company. They're going to help recruit management, and all of these are issues that require a fair amount of contact with the company. Obviously, the further that you have to travel to have that contact, the fewer companies you can invest in. So they have strong incentives to maintain, relatively geographically focused portfolios of companies, and that's precisely what you see them do. The last one that I want to talk about is this sort of issue of putting the pieces together. And this is a lesson to me in how not to do animation. But, so again, so the VC is just one example of this, but the evidence is, again, shows that one of the most important factors in determining whether or not an entrepreneur or an inventor is likely to get funding has to do with whether or not they have some sort of connection either to the venture capitalists or potentially through a third party. So this was actually a pretty interesting study that was done where they were comparing sort of what are the odds that an inventor is going to get funding from a venture capitalist if they have, sort of either no direct connection or no known indirect connection. So there might be like some path of 5 or 6 people, supposedly we're all connected at whatever 6 degrees of separation, that would actually link the inventor to the VC, but there's no close connection between the two. And they compared that to the first set is what if the inventor and the VC actually knew each other, before the sort of they even came up with the idea. And it turns out that that sort of direct connection increases the odds of being funded by 48%. Right? What happens if it's an indirect connection? Right? If it's not that you know the VC, but you at least know someone who knows a VC. Well, it turns out in that case it's actually 66%. And there may be some good reasons why it's higher. It may be just accidental. But it's also possible, again, that venture capitalists sort of recognize to a certain extent their own potential bias when they're dealing with someone that they know, and may actually then be more willing to trust sort of a third-party connection.
What's the success rate when the inventor and the VC do not know each other?
Well, that would be the baseline, right? So the baseline is both the 48% and the 66% are above the baseline, exactly. And the baseline is low. No, it's not quite that bad. In this set, the baseline, I think, is about 4% in this study. Yeah. So why are connections so important? Again, I've talked a fair amount about why they're important in the sort of capital setting. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's sort of a fair amount of importance about private information. In particular, venture capitalists, when they write that check for a company, is really making a leap of faith. They don't know that much about whether this is actually going to turn out. They're making a gamble. They hope an educated gamble. But the same type of problems affect other potential constituents as well. So labor, right? Labor are maybe even in a worse situation, right? If you think of yourself as sort of an entrepreneur who now needs to go out and recruit some good, talented people to work for your company. Well, the same type of uncertainty exists there. They don't really know that much about the science. They may not know that much about you. And there's potentially a lot of kind of private information problems. You clearly do know more about the technology than they do. But the individual that you might be hiring has an even greater problem, which is that unlike the investor, right, like an institutional investor might put 6% of their total assets into this asset class, into venture capital, and that's going to be spread across multiple firms. The individual is putting 100% of their labor typically into a firm, right? So it's a far riskier prospect for an individual to join a new entrepreneurial firm than it is for an investor to get involved. And so recruiting that labor, particularly the first few employees, is oftentimes highly dependent on either you having a personal connection and getting basically a friend or former colleague to come in on it, or once the money is involved, VCs and angels oftentimes play a role in helping to convince other actors to sort of come in. And part of that convincing is a little bit of a guarantee that if you sort of help us out here, we'll be sort of favorably inclined if you have an idea in the future that you might want funded. The same type of issue also affects potential partners, right? So there's suppliers. Now, some suppliers, it doesn't matter. Some suppliers are just giving you, sort of generic reagents, and so long as you pay the price, they're going to be happy to supply them. But other times, you actually want relatively specific goods from these suppliers, right? You might actually want them to develop some type of complementary technology to what the entrepreneurial venture is working on, and yet again, they're sort of vexed by this uncertainty and private information. So social connections there are also important to getting those suppliers or potentially buyers to commit to the organization. Another type of connection problem is actually a more subtle one, and I think actually a more interesting one. And this is that is a problem that I'm going to just talk about homophily in founding teams. So imagine that these different colors are entrepreneurs that are involved in founding a company that have different backgrounds. Right? So let's say that the orange here is actually the scientist, the guy that's got the sort of the initial idea. Let's say the green is somebody who's actually got sort of a sales background, how you think about promoting the product. And the purple is somebody that maybe has more of a kind of managerial background. Right? If you look at the literature, it's pretty clear that what you want for founding teams are what's on the left. Right? You want teams that have sort of the complete portfolio of functional, sort of expertise. Now, if you look at what teams actually get formed, they're more like the ones on the right, right? So you'll have like 3 salespeople who get together and say, well, we don't have any technology, but, we've got a great marketing plan, Or you'll get maybe a couple of scientists who say, well, we aren't going to really worry about what the market is, but this science is, really cool. No one else has been able to do it, so, we'll find somebody that's willing to buy it, right? Or, maybe you get sort of the, too many managers, right? You can actually have a sort of too many chiefs problem in certain types of startups. The difficulty here is why do you get the sort of the wrong type of team. And the reason you get the wrong type of team is that if you look at most people, right, their social connections or who they're actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis are people that are like them, right? So the salesperson is generally talking with other salespeople. The scientists are hanging out in their lab, chatting with the other scientists. And the critical issue here then is that, when they're sort of forming these things up and they need to sort of, rely on these tight connections, the only other people they know are people that are like them, all right? So that the challenge here is clearly how do you get connections that are kind of across the group so that you can have teams that are like on the left-hand side. Why isn't this? There we go. Okay. So to kind of come close to wrapping this up, I think I'm still within time here. I want to kind of end with a tale of two cities. And this is kind of pushing the networks up to another level. And this is really looking at the two cities here are Akron, Ohio, and Rochester, New York. Now, if you looked at Akron and Rochester in 1980, this kind of 1980 to 1982 period, these cities are really similar in a lot of ways. Right? They're very close together geographically. They're pretty similar in terms of the overall size of the city. Both are about 700 to 900,000 in population. They're actually, and this may surprise some people, they're actually very similar in the proportion of the community that's employed by a university. Right? So Rochester is probably better known, but University of Akron is a pretty large school, and there's also a couple of large colleges in Akron, Ohio. They also had very similar numbers of patents, right? So if you looked at their patent productivity in 80 to 82, you were seeing about the same amount of kind of raw material, it seemed like, coming out. They had roughly the same GDP per capita. All in all, in a lot of ways, you could look at these as being kind of sister cities. Now, one thing that's different, though, is if you look at these networks, right, the networks look different, right? It's hard to say exactly why, right? I mean, we're not sort of used to usually looking at these drawings, but it's pretty clear that the one on the left side seems a little bit less kind of interconnected or linked than the one on the right side. Now, unfortunately, with the screen here, I'm not sure if you can see it on the handouts. Each one of these little nodes or little dots on the network has a name connected to it. It's a name of a company or a research institute or a university. And basically what the connections are all the instances in which those two organizations cooperated either in basic research or in commercialization on a patent. And what's happening is that in Akron, you've got some strong research institutions. This one over here is a university that's connected to a lot of other universities. This is a university connected to a lot of other universities. And then, in the middle, you've got one firm that actually is connected to some of the other firms. But in general, there's not much connection. It's actually even hard to decipher what's going on in Rochester because you have such a tight interconnection around a bunch of different companies, all related to the University of Rochester, which is the big node right there. Now, what happens over the next 20 years is quite interesting because what we see is that the networks become even more divergent, right? Akron continues to be this kind of, a player here, a player there, a couple of basically unconnected universities. Rochester, on the other hand, becomes dramatically interconnected, right? Those first few interconnections become key linkages to connecting a lot of other players within this community. So now you've got all the major research institutes are connected with a number of the major firms, which are connected with the major university. And over the same period, we also start to see a real divergence in the productivity of the two. So the level of patenting over this time roughly triples in Rochester. In Akron, it goes up by about 15 to 20%. The per capita income in Rochester begins to outstrip Akron by about $3,000 to $4,000 per year per capita, which may not sound like that much, but that's 10% of the difference in the average GDP per person. So one of the things that, again, this is really just a case study, and so it's somewhat anecdotal, but there have been a couple of other case studies done like this, and it seems that there's a real difference between these cities that have the same, in some sense, raw materials. They have the same kind of, intellectual inputs, the same type of financial communities, but there's a difference between those that actually have interconnections between these and therefore are able to coordinate activities relative to those that do not and that are really operating much more separately. So the last thing that I want to sort of just briefly go over to end up with is to say that, so what I really see as kind of a central challenge is creating these connections. In particular, I think that some of the connections that are most important to create are those that link these individuals and organizations that are really from, kind of different, in some sense, communities, right? Maybe they have the science, maybe they have money, maybe they have the managerial expertise. The reason why I see those as really being critical is because those are the ones that, if we were going to sort of go back to the sort of earlier questioning, those are the ones that don't tend to form organically, right? Those are ones that the kind of natural forces almost seem to operate against. And that's it. So I'm open for questions.
I must be me. I'm sorry, I'm too soft-spoken. We run a program called Canada's Top 10 Life Sciences Companies, where we effectively have jurors, independent juries of venture capitalists from Canada and the United States choose the top 10 companies, so the top 5 startups, the top 5 emerging companies. We've been doing this for a period of time. Last year, not in 2006, in 2005, we took that group with the help of the Canadian consulates to Boston, New York, and San Francisco. And the numbers of people, investors from those communities that turned out was very high. We repeated it this year. I think we had 20 VCs in Boston, 50, some in New York, and we're still working on San Diego and San Francisco for March. The success of the program was, though, that we were able to have a juried group. The VCs who were coming knew that the group of companies had already been vetted, so that they already knew the high quality. They could see who the judges were, who were their peers, and then, as a result, came out. As a result of the 2005, Variation Biotechnologies scored $35.7 million from a syndicate of 3 U.S. venture capitalists. There were no Canadian venture capitalist groups in that piece. And they met their lead investor, Claris, in Boston, and they met 5 a.m. in San Francisco, and then those groups then came together with a third to form a consortium. So all of the stats that you're talking about in terms of the distance, I think, are important, but I think it's the face-to-face piece. So first of all, people aren't willing to spend any time unless there's something of value, number one. Number two is that you need the face-to-face, because what happened was they actually met those people in January, and at the end of September or early October in BioContact, saw the company again, and within 8 weeks they had a term sheet.
Now, if we did that by video conference, so you've got...
Wouldn't have happened.
Wouldn't have happened.
It wouldn't have happened.
Well, what's face-to-face in person versus...
Because they can sit down and read your face, they can talk to you afterwards.
You can't do that by video
You can't do that by video conference. You can do it afterwards once you've met. But my experience is no, you can't.
Well, I think if you looked at what happened in the first part of the day today, people were talking not just by asking questions the speakers or commenting, and people were not just talking during lunch. People were also having chats after lunch, having coffee, and maybe in the washroom as well. And you cannot have these things with a teleconferencing.
If I could I was going to comment, that was quite a fancy term you used, and I couldn't replicate it. There's something about the depth of the immersion. I think it just comes down to the very basic person-to-person relationship building, and it introduces that basic level of trust, because you get to know people, and you can't get to know people outside of the three-dimension experience, which requires not just visual, not just sound, but all the sensory stuff and everything else. And that's just the authenticity of relationship and the quality of being human. So it's okay to talk about relationships.
I guess on the flip side is that having some of the technologies that are out there, you can capture some of that knowledge that was had at the urinal and transfer it so that when that person leaves, you've still got that. So, the foundation is there in the relationship, but the infrastructure can be there to communicate that to a wider audience.
No, I was just going to say that it really, I mean, it's all about the relationship, but it's also about the fact that if I'm an investor and I can't have an opportunity to interact with you, I'm not going to give you my money. So, that's really the bottom line when we're out looking for investment as a company, or you're the investor on the other side. If I don't know you and I can't spend any level of time with you, even if it's 20 minutes, just to get that first initial reaction, the likelihood of me giving you my money is slim and none.
And one last thing on the connection between individuals is really important. Where we've seen the most success with investment coming back to Canada has been when we're dealing with expatriate Canadians who know the community, who are living in Boston, New York, San Francisco, or wherever, and who want to make a connection back. And that goes not just from an investment point of view, but from a scientist point of view and from a partnering point of view in strategic alliances.
So I'd like to turn a question to Olav. The question here, to some extent, some of your information is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't have a venture capital firm, if you don't have star scientists, nothing will happen, because nobody will get out of their office unless they actually happen to know them from a prior relationship. So the question here is, how can we break that pattern, and what mechanisms actually work? So Ken has provided a mechanism that appears to work. Can you offer any research that less anecdotally and more robustly says, here are tools that have worked in other environments, and they may not be investing, but... Right.
There's not a tremendous amount of research on this, though I think it's an important topic. The thing that... So I think the thing to think about that's kind of interesting here is imagine that you sort of, you're trying to connect up a couple of people that don't know each other, right? And I actually like the idea. Who was it, Etienne, that wanted to introduce a couple that he thought maybe should be together, which I think is a great example, right? So if Etienne knows them both, right, and is friends with them, he can actually broker that. He can be a matchmaker, right? But the challenge, I think, is that you can't really be a matchmaker if you don't have connections to both parties, or have some way of, kind of getting connections to both parties. Because, imagine that, so I think a good example for me is that every week I get an invitation to speak at some conference, wherever, China, Europe, I don't really like to travel that much, so I basically turn down almost 100% of these. And in fact, if we sort of said, how many do I turn down where the person that's inviting me is someone that I haven't met before, it is 100%. I basically am never going to take an invitation just across the board. So you could imagine, like a policy, being that the government's going to start sending out invitations to VCs and scientists and ask them to come to meet at the same room at, noon on Tuesday, probably you're not going to get great, feedback. They just, without knowing the person that's doing the inviting, they don't trust that it's going to be worth their time, right? I think that. So, the most of the research that's been done that sort of shows where these connections come from actually are funny in the sense that they're not policies; they're accidental, right? So, the places where you see things are crises. So when you have something like a disaster, this tends to get parties that never interacted before to actually interact, and some of those end up being lasting connections. In fact, there's some evidence that, not in this example between Akron and Rochester, but there's another kind of case study that's been done. And precisely what had happened there in one of the communities was there was a little bit of a, kind of a crisis from a flood that seemed to have brought together various leaders from different communities. In that case, the business community as well as the academic community and even the religious community, which then facilitated a number of programs. You can also, another thing that tends to bring together these parties is wildly popular sort of external events. So like within the VC community, one of the things that you see as being a critical moment for the connections within Silicon Valley or within Boston is like a particular fad. So the semiconductor funding fad, everybody was trying to get into semiconductors for a while. And what it meant was there were a lot of people that had been specializing in different industries, but now they all wanted to go after the same firm, right? And that actually got a lot of them to have their first interconnection. And then after that, you see them continue to carry on and investing together. But it's really how do you get the initial connection? And, it is a challenge. And I think that, that part of the challenge is trying to think of creative ways for doing that. I mean, I actually really like this idea of the kind of having things vetted and then bring them around. I think that's very creative, although, there are VCs in Toronto, and there's sort of no reason why the Toronto VC community shouldn't be connected in.
Okay, so Dominic, this is definitely not a presentation. No overheads, no slides. This is a comment. They'd asked me to try to link some of what was being said in the previous sessions to work that we have been doing in Ontario over the last 10, 12 years, mostly on innovation systems, but also on industrial clusters. And so I'm going to be really, really brief, and that's why I don't have slides. I just want to pick up on maybe 3, 4, 5 points at most that I think where some of the things I've heard from the three presenters resonate with some of the things either in the literature or in our own research. So the innovation systems literature is fairly broad. It originates in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. It's been elaborated at the national level, the regional level, the sectoral level now. I think people are working on other dimensions of it as well. For this purpose, I think the piece of it that's most relevant and most important is the idea that comes out of that body of literature that innovation is an interactive process of social learning. And I think that's where it intersects most directly with what Etienne was talking about this morning. And in some of the work we've done, we've talked about learning across 3 dimensions, or learning at 3 different dimensions, and that is individual learning. Individuals, whether they work in a research environment, in a university, in a firm, learning to do new and different things, acquiring new skills. Firms learning at the level of the firm, and this is firms learning to do different things. It also has a lot to do with the notion that's very prominent in the literature about absorptive capacity. Someone made the distinction this morning, I think, Deb, between information and knowledge. And for firms, when it comes to innovation or commercialization, the key challenge is really how do you differentiate among the enormous body of scientific literature out there? How does a firm decide what might be of potentially commercial value? And the idea of absorptive capacity simply says that firms have to invest in their own research base. Without their own research base, without their own knowledge base, they don't have the criteria to choose among or select what may be commercially valuable to them. And then the third dimension, and the one that we've been doing most of our work at, is the level of the region and networks, and that can include industrial clusters as a subset of that. Some people have used networks and clusters almost interchangeably, although they're not quite the same thing. And here it's how do regions learn to do something different from the way they've done it in the past. And my understanding about what's been going on in Ontario for the last, I'd say since about 96 or 97, is that Ontario as a province, but regions within Ontario, have been trying to learn how do we innovate better and how do we commercialize our knowledge base more effectively. And that again goes back to the interactive dimension. That only happens in interaction. All the things that Olav was talking about this morning, I think, are highly relevant to that, and proximity is important, and it does happen very effectively on a regional and a local basis. The one thing that I would add, though, that I think I would throw into the mix to differentiate it, I always distinguish between innovation and commercialization. I always see commercialization as a subset of innovation. So I see innovation as being a much broader concept and evolving knowledge transfer in many dimensions in many different ways and many different kinds of knowledge. And there's a growing body of literature now that we're dealing with that differentiates between knowledge bases and argues that the scientific knowledge base fundamentally influences how knowledge is transferred and how innovation takes place. And I think that's important to keep in mind when you're talking about commercialization. And there are a number of typologies that have been developed. One of these typologies distinguishes between analytic, synthetic, and symbolic knowledge bases. So the analytic would be the more science-based. The life sciences would clearly fall into that category. Synthetic would be more, I don't want to say practical, but learning by using, learning by doing, learning by interacting. And symbolic is more the creative industry, so multimedia, fashion design, broadcasting, those sorts of things would be among the symbolic industries, or the symbolic knowledge bases, which again are quite different. And the important thing to keep in mind is that what firms take from the knowledge base varies dramatically across those different scientific fields or scientific enterprises, and this is confirmed very strongly in work that comes out of two big surveys of R&D managers that were done in the U.S., one at Yale in the 80s, another one at Carnegie Mellon in the late 90s. And in both of those studies, they demonstrated quite consistently that industrial research managers look for very different things depending on the field of research. And in some fields, all they really want to know is where's the scientific frontier moving. That's what they look for from university research. They're not looking for specific research results that they can commercialize and apply. I think the other major point there's two other major points I want to make, and then I'll stop. I want to reiterate a point that was made by, I think, all three of you in slightly different ways this morning about the person-embodied nature of knowledge transfer. The most effective way to commercialize knowledge is when someone walks out the door and takes the knowledge with them. I learned this most dramatically in an interview I was doing with, I think it was an Ottawa laser-based firm who'd partnered with a U of T chemistry professor and the professor on an Ontario government-funded project again. And the professor had said, oh, well, we did this great research on the project. I trained this great postdoctoral fellow in this firm in Ottawa, hired him, and then they developed a commercial product, based on our research. And I went to get an interview with the research manager at the Ottawa firm, and he said, why do you want to talk to me? And I said, well, you partnered with this U of T professor, and he developed this technology, and you hired a student and commercialized it. He said, no, I didn't. I mean, they were doing some interesting research. They did some show and tells for us. It was kind of interesting. But we were working on our own product, and we really wanted the postdoc because they had the research skills and the knowledge frontier that we thought, could then come into our firm and use that knowledge base to help us develop the product that we had been working on our own for a long time. So I think it was a very sort of an aha moment for me, I think, as you said, Deb. It was a moment when I realized, these perspectives are quite different, and what looks like knowledge transfer from the perspective of the university professor looks very, very different from the perspective of the industrial R&D manager, and don't ever confuse the two, and make sure you triangulate to know what's going on. And that's why I think the graduate students and sometimes less than graduate students and postdocs are so fundamentally important to the whole knowledge transfer process. We've done a lot of work on Waterloo in the last 3 or 4 years, the ICT cluster in Waterloo. I'll leave you with this final comment. One of the things that came out of our research was the central role that the co-op program at the University of Waterloo plays in the knowledge transfer process and in holding the whole cluster together. This wasn't particularly shocking or new information that we discovered, because everyone cites the co-op program as one of the really fundamental key features as part of the success story in Waterloo. But one of the things that we found out through some of the interviews we did is one of the reasons why the firms value the co-op students is because co-op students give them an avenue of access and insight back into the university. So when we talk about knowledge transfer and commercialization from a university point of view or a research hospital point of view, maybe less so the case in the research hospital, we tend to think of it in terms of what people writing in the innovation literature call the science push perspective on innovation. There's all this knowledge, all this research being done in the university, and the goal of the university and the goal of the tech transfer office and all the commercialization programs is to push that knowledge out of the university into the hands of firms, or to train university researchers to be effective entrepreneurs in taking it and commercializing it. From the point of view of the firm, particularly the non-life sciences firm out there in the community, the university is this huge potential reservoir of knowledge and information that can be used to help them solve concrete technical problems that they're working on, often of an incremental nature in terms of innovation rather than a radical nature. Their problem is they don't know how to get access to that information, and most university tech transfer offices aren't set up to do that. What the co-op program does is it provides the firm with a very easy and a very efficient avenue of access back into the knowledge base of the university, because the co-op student will often say to the research manager they're working with, oh, I know a prof, or my prof talked about that kind of stuff in a course we did last year. I bet you she or he could help us solve this particular problem. Why don't I give them a call and see what they have to say? So in this sense, and I hadn't thought of it before today, but I thank Etienne for this, I think the co-op program kind of functions as a very large scale of community of practice within the community of Waterloo that ties a lot of the firms together very effectively into the research environment in the university and other universities, and works very, very effectively in that way. So that's some thoughts on what I've